Okay, so normally we had planned to do this PowerPoint in class, but due to unforeseen circumstances, you are getting this as a video. So it's kind of like I'm there, but I'm not. Sorry. So today we're going to learn about speciation, which you've read about in chapter 24. So you already know that the word speciation means how new species come about. I also would like you to take the time to go ahead and click on this link here, which will take you to the Bozeman Science video on speciation. You're going to have to do that as part of your homework assignment because it is a YouTube video, so you can't watch it in class. The Bozeman Science website is a fantastic resource for you. If you're not understanding something in class, it's a science teacher who does something similar to what Dr. Mead and I are doing, where he has videos of the content, and they're great. They're easy to understand. So if you have not done so, if you have not watched this video that Dr. Mead posted a few days ago on species and reproductive isolation, then you need to do that because there are some things that Mr. Anderson, that's the teacher, covers that I don't. So it will behoove you to do that. So there are two patterns of speciation. There are two ways that new species can come about, and not just in parrots, like you're seeing here in this picture. New species can come about in all sorts of organisms. One is called anagenesis. So we probably know that the term genesis means creation. And anagenesis is phyletic evolution. It's the accumulation of heritable changes resulting in a new species. So what all those big words mean is that all of these changes accumulate, all of these changes that can be inherited, right? So not acquired traits like that dummy Lamarck thought. So changes that are genetic, they accumulate over time, and you eventually get a new species. Okay, so this blue and green patterned bird eventually over time accumulated lots of different changes to change to this um, lighter colored blue. And I'm sure there's some other changes involved. Oh, his beak too. It's like one of those games where you have to decide what's the difference between these two birds. Probably not the most important part of this PowerPoint today. And then you can have cladogenesis, which is what we call branching evolution. And this is the more common pattern of speciation. And we call it branching evolution. Gee, I wonder why. Take a look at the picture. This is where the gene pool is splitting into two, and we're creating an additional species. So we start out with our old pal Bob here, the bluebird, and he still exists right here, but the gene pool is split into two, and now we have this new crazy concoction bird with this bombed tail and this red part, and yeah, he's crazy awesome, whatever he did. And remember that all of these traits are heritable as well. That's what causes evolution. The traits have to be inherited. And when you have this split in the gene pool, this adds to biodiversity. So over here, we only have one species that no longer exists and a new species that now exists. So when you look at how many birds exist in the world, you still only have, I guess, one, according to this picture. But over here, you have start out with one type of bird that exists in the world, and now you have two. And so we've increased the amount of biodiversity in the world. So biodiversity means the different types of living things, and that's a good thing. It makes for a more interesting trip to the zoo, right? Because if there's only one type of bird in the world, it'd be a pretty short trip, pretty boring trip to the zoo. But also, variation is a good thing for evolution. Excuse me. Right? When you're talking about an environmental change, you want to have more variation because if there's less variation, then there's more of a problem of killing off species. So we keep using this word species, we keep tossing it around, we toss it around quite a bit. And I lectured A Block about let's be careful about this word species because we're using it in incorrect fashion sometimes. So here's where we're going to address how to define the term species. I'm sure you all know that species means a small, like the the tightest way to classify a group of organisms, but scientists really get into it and they really have these different concepts of what a species is, because when you think about it, there's lots of different ways to define a species. So currently we use the biological species concept. And what that means is that individuals can breed in nature, so in the natural world, and they produce viable offspring. So what viable offspring mean is that the offspring can survive, and the offspring themselves are fertile, and they can mate and produce viable offspring, viable fertile offspring. So that's a biological species concept. And there is something called reproductive isolation. So it's exactly what it sounds like. It prevents two members of a species, different species, from producing viable, fertile hybrids. And hybrids is what we call the offspring from two different species. So reproductive isolation is what goes on that prevents members of two different species from producing viable, fertile hybrids. So there are two basic types of reproductive isolation, and it all depends on this thing right here. So this little drawing here is what we call a zygote. And a zygote is a fertilized egg. So as soon as that sperm hits the egg, we call it a zygote. It's no longer a sperm egg, which would be a weird term. We call it a zygote. And so we have prezygotic barriers to reproductive isolation, and we have post-zygotic barriers. So there are all sorts of mechanisms to prevent members of different species from reproducing with one another. And some are prezygotic, so they prevent the sperm and the egg from ever seeing each other, and some are postzygotic. So yeah, intercourse can happen between members of different species, but the zygote may not ever end up going anywhere. This is a picture from your book. And what you're going to do in class is you and a partner are going to have a little project where you have some fun with these prezygotic and postzygotic barriers. I would also really encourage you, if you have not yet listened to the Bozeman Science video, that's what you need to do. Mr. Anderson does a great job looking at this. So this is what you need to explore on your own. The top in the pink here, all of the different prezygotic barriers. So there are different categories. Here, all prevent a mating attempt. So there's no mating attempt here. Over here, prevent fertilization from actually happening. And then in, I don't know, what do we call this, mint green? These are all post-zygotic barriers, and these all prevent viable, fertile offspring. But again, what you're going to do is you are going to teach the class these concepts. So that's your job. And there's that icon, and if you click on it, it's a link to the Bozeman Science video, which you're going to watch, right? Right. Okay, moving on. So there's the biological species concept that says that you're a member of your own species if you can mate and produce viable fertile offspring with the other members of your species. If you cannot interbreed with the other members of this group, then you're not part of that species. That's the biological species concept. So are there any other ways to define species? There must be, because the rest of this slide is blank, right? There's the morphological species concept. And we characterize the morphological species concept by body shape, size, and other structural features. It's a pretty easy one to remember because think about it, morphological, morph, shape, right? My Harry Potter nerds, polymorph juice, yeah? There's the paleontological species concept, which only uses fossils. So they group together fossils and they analyze fossils to define a species. There's the ecological species concept, and species are grouped based on their niche or their role in the biological community. And we'll talk more about the niche when we get into our ecology unit, but it's basically an organism's place where they live, what they eat, what shelter they need in the community. And there's the phylogenetic species concept, where species are related or species are grouped based on their unique genetic history. So there are a few different ways to define a species. Mostly right now, the biological species concept is used, but some of these other concepts are used as well. So it's not like these are passe and these are tossed. These are used as well, but the biological species concept is the one most commonly used. Yay, study guide questions! Aren't you so excited? So take out your pen and paper, maybe pause this. Okay, this is playing in class, so the substitute could pause this video so the students could write down the answers. That would be fantastic. The first three questions here are, why are there multiple definitions to define species? So I mentioned that the other ones that we talked about are not not that they're no longer used. They're just not used as much. So why do you think that is? Why are we muddying the waters with all of these different definitions? And to go along with that, question number 2, what would be the advantages and the disadvantages to each species concept, including the biological species concept? So what are the pros and cons to each of these concepts? And the final question is, which of these species concepts, so just make a list, could be used to define asexual organisms and sexual organisms? Alrighty, moving on. We've talked about speciation, we've talked about what species are, so let's get into it. How do new species arise? There are two main mechanisms. One is called allopatric speciation, and this derives from the word, the Greek prefix allos meaning other and patra meaning homeland. So it's basically geographic isolation. The gene flow is interrupted, and now we have two subpopulations. So we have this fish that biologists love called cichlids. They're in one lake, and something happens. Somebody threw a big pile of dirt, apparently, and now there's two populations, and over time, for whatever reason, we now have a group of orange cichlids and a group of blue cichlids. Because of this dirt here, obviously the fish cannot jump from one pond to another. Let's just assume that they're not super awesome fish. And the gene flow cannot go back and forth. We have an interruption in allele frequency. Say there's some kind of preference for bluefish over here, and so now we're going to see speciation occur, right? They also can't interbreed. These two populations cannot interbreed, and so now we have a new species. The other type of speciation is just the opposite of allopatric speciation. So if allopatric speciation is geographic isolation, sympatric speciation is they're not geographically isolated. And so sym meaning same, and patric meaning homeland. So they're in the same place. So we have the lake, and for whatever reason, this area, we have some bluefish developing, and they have become their own species. And we'll talk about various ways that could occur. And again, sympatric speciation, they're geographically overlapping populations, and there's multiple mechanisms for that. And that's pretty much going to be the focus for the rest of this talk. Before we get into the various mechanisms of sympatric speciation, you need to have a good grasp of chromosome count and all of these different ploidy words. So haploid, diploid, triploid, and tetraploid. Fun words to say. So ploidy refers to the copies of chromosomes the organism has in its nucleus. So haploid, we'll start with diploid. Body cells, your somatic cells, what we call your body cells, all the cells, like your skin cells, everybody touch your skin. Those skin cells there are diploid. And what that means is that you have one copy from your mom, one chromosome from your mom, and one chromosome from your dad. So think to your strawfish lab. You pulled out two alleles. You could think thought of that as maybe even chromosomes, right? You're pulling out one chromosome from mom and one chromosome from dad. And those were diploid cells. You made diploid cells. Sex cells, we refer to them as gametes, are haploid. Nobody touch your sex cells, please. That's inappropriate. And the reason why your sex cells are haploid, so here you see the haploid cells, they have only one copy of each chromosome. The reason why the sex cells are haploid is so that when the egg and sperm join together, when they become fertilized, they become diploid. Okay, that fertilized egg, that zygote, new word, best hangman word ever, by the way. Okay, so when the egg and sperm join together, there will then only be two chromosomes. So think about it. A haploid cell plus a haploid cell yields a diploid cell. So now let's talk about one mechanism of sympatric speciation. So they're in the same location. Okay, there's no geographic isolation for speciation to occur. And we're going to call this polyploidy. Okay, so what's going to happen is multiple sets of chromosomes are going to cause a new species to arise. So let's take a look at this diagram. And I chose this diagram because it comes from your book, and I feel like your book very awkwardly explains it. So I'm going to try to non-awkwardly explain it. One point here is that polyploidy mostly happens in plants. And at the end of this, I'm going to talk to you about a few common plants that maybe you've even had for breakfast that are a result of polyploidy. So the first point here is a diploid cell, so your normal body cell, duplicates its DNA before cell division. So think of cell division as like mitosis or meiosis, but it makes a copy of all of its DNA before it divides. And sometimes, just sometimes, during cell division, not everything goes right. So error! The DNA did not divide properly, and the new cell, the resulting cell, one of the resulting cells, is what we call tetraploid, meaning that it has 4 copies of each chromosome instead of only 2 copies of each chromosome. By the way, these 2 ends, 4 ends, do you guys get what that is? Yeah, that's how many copies of the chromosome it has. Okay, and equaling 6, equaling 12. Right, because it has 3 different types of chromosomes. So it's 2 times 3 equals 6. So there are 2 copies of 3 different types of chromosomes. So total number of chromosomes in the cell are 6. 2 copies of 3 different types. Great, let's move on. So we've got this new cell where the DNA did not divide properly. The new cell is tetraploid. Normally, if this were to happen in your body, the tetraploid cell would just have to die. It's no good. We don't like tetraploid cells. But plants were like, okay, cool, you're tetraploid. And this could arise, this could be like a branch or something, you know, just a tetraploid branch on a tree. Because the tree's like, yeah, whatever, it's fine. I got a tetraploid branch, what's new? I'm a tree. I don't know if that's what trees think, maybe. And now this branch will eventually give rise, will have flowers in the spring. And those flowers produce, that's right, sex cells or gametes. And the gametes are half of whatever the cell it came from. So if it normally came from a diploid cell, the 2N, it would only have 1 copy. But because it came from this tetraploid cell, and it's half of this, so it's going to have 2N. So the tetraploid cell makes cells, sex cells, that are diploid instead of haploid. Those sex cells are going to combine to form new cells that are tetraploid, and so it goes. Just to prove that, also I made this great image. These are the sex cells, and they have a little heart because they're in love. And they make a new cell that are tetraploid, and now they make a new plant. And that's how they became the polyploidy bunch. Some of the plants that you are aware of that are polyploidy: delicious strawberries, bananas with eyeballs, and plain bananas, and wheat. Probably had wheat today, if not yesterday. Coffee, also polyploidy. Ferns, lots of plants. Okay, plants can deal with this polyploidy. Us, not so much. We're not pleasant. There's another another ploidy mechanism for sympatric speciation um, in plants called allopolyploidy. So let's go through this. There's the difference between polyploidy and allopolyploidy is that allo means other. So in the one example that I just did is it's the same plant, right? Within the plant, there was an error in cell division. Here we're talking other. So what's happening is there's two different species and they somehow mate what? Their offspring, which we call a hybrid, is sterile. Sad face. Now, plants can asexually reproduce. So they asexually reproduce for a little while, and then through various mechanisms which are still largely unknown, they begin to be able to sexually reproduce. And this is how allopolyploidy, this is also how we get new species of plants. Fascinating. So the difference between allopolyploidy and regular polyploidy, also sometimes called autopolyploidy, so self-polyploidy, is that in allopolyploidy, it's between two different species of plants. Habitat differentiation is another mechanism of sympatric speciation, and this is when one group of the species prefers one habitat, while another group prefers the other. And so this is a story about, this is a colonial story. It's very timely. This is apple season. One of my favorite things to do is to go apple picking. And this is actually a picture I took while apple picking, just to blow my own horn. So the hawthorn fly is common in this climate, in our climate here, and it is an example of a population that is currently evolving. There are different populations that are feeding on different types of fruit. In North America, in the early 19th century, apples were first introduced to the area, and there was a population, a subpopulation of what was then called the hawthorn fly that preferred to eat the apple fruit. And now, people, this is important, there is one group of this species that only prefers to eat apple. And there is another group that only prefers to eat the fruit of the hawthorn tree, which is pictured here. So we are seeing sympatric speciation in progress. Okay, so the hawthorn fly versus the apple maggot. And that's what it's a delightful name, isn't it? And there's further evidence besides just the preference of what they eat. There has been allele frequency changes, and also the hawthorn fly matures later in the season and takes longer to mature. And there has been very little evidence of interbreeding between what's been called the hawthorn fly and the apple maggot. So scientists do believe that they're seeing sympatric speciation in progress. Sexual selection can also be an example of sympatric speciation. So back to our cichlids, this is a fish found in Africa, and normally in this species, the females prefer males that are brightly colored. In this species, the females just really don't care. And this is because this species live in a lake that has muddy waters. And they find that there is no interbreeding based on this behavioral barrier. Okay, so this female would not mate with this male. This female definitely would not mate with this male because he does not have a cool uh, blue and orange scale. Okay. Adaptive radiation, this is when we have many new species from a common ancestor due to a new environment. Um, So this is really commonly seen on islands. This example here is Hawaii and all of the various odd plants that you see on the Hawaiian Islands. Tend to think of Darwin's finches and the Galapagos Islands and all of the different species of finches seen on the islands due to the different environments on those islands, all the different beak shapes and the different foods they had to eat on those islands. However, it's important to consider that adaptive radiation can be due to both allopatric and sympatric speciation. So islands are a great example of geographic isolation, right? You're on an island and you can't go anywhere else, pretty much. So you are geographically isolated, and so yes, your species is going to evolve into perhaps a new species. And yes, you had a common ancestor, but now there's all these different species on the different islands. But it also can occur in sympatric speciation, maybe due to habitat differentiation, maybe due to sexual selection, maybe due to a bunch of different things that we've discussed. But that's adaptive radiation. Punctuated equilibrium, again, was discussed by Mr. Anderson, but I'm going to go over it as well. So we have gradualism is the idea that species descend from a common ancestor and gradually over time accumulate these different changes, and you'll see eventually see the change. Punctuated equilibrium is then these new species, they change the most when they bud from their parent, and then they enter a stasis, so kind of no change for the rest of their existence. So it's like this pop of change. Pardon me, little technical difficulty there. Back to it. So when they branch off from their parent ancestor, from their common ancestor, that's the most change, and then they enter stasis. So they don't really change much after that. That's punctuated equilibrium versus gradualism. Both are models of evolution to consider. And that is that.